Imagine a place where the very concept of tolerance is considered a slur, and a stranger is not a guest, but a target. We are at the Rusty Nail bar, tucked away somewhere in the sun-scorched wastelands of Texas, 1966. The air here is so thick with tobacco smoke, the smell of burnt meat, and cheap whiskey that it feels like you could cut it with a knife. In the corner, under the dim glow of a billiard lamp, stands Bruce Lee. He isn't looking for trouble. He just stopped for a glass of water on his way to Los Angeles. But in this world, saturated with Confederate flags and racial prejudice, his very presence is a provocation. Suddenly, the hum of conversation dies down, replaced by a tense silence that sends a chill down your spine. A mountain of a man, a local legend nicknamed Bulldozer, approaches Bruce. He is 140 kilograms of live weight, wrapped in leather and denim, with crumbs from yesterday's dinner stuck in his beard and eyes full of muddy, drunken hatred. Bulldozer stops half a meter from Bruce, violating every boundary of personal space. He slowly gathers saliva, mixed with chewing tobacco in his mouth, and spits squarely onto the toe of Bruce's perfectly polished boot. The sound of the spit in this silence rings out like a gunshot. "We don't like your kind here," he growls, his voice sounding like gravel grinding in a concrete mixer. "Get back to China before I turn you into mincemeat." The crowd holds its breath. The local rednecks smirk, anticipating a bloody show. They are certain this little guy is about to be smeared across the floor. But Bruce Lee doesn't move. He doesn't even look at his ruined boot. He looks directly into the giant's eyes, and in that gaze, there isn't a drop of fear, only an icy calm that begins to unnerve Bulldozer. And this is where a detail enters the fray that turns an ordinary drunken brawl into a scene from a western. Look at the biker's head. Perched on the back of it is an old, greasy, misshapen cowboy hat. This piece of felt is not just headwear. It is the crown of the local king, a symbol of his power and untouchability. No one in this bar dares to even look sideways at that hat. Bulldozer, feeling his authority threatened by the victim's silence, decides to raise the stakes. He grabs a heavy glass beer mug from the table. The glass is thick and faceted, capable of crushing a skull with one blow. He winds up his arm. "Are you deaf, boy?" he bellows, spraying saliva. Bruce slowly raises his head. A barely perceptible smile touches his lips. "I hear you," he says quietly, but so clearly that every word carves itself into memory. "But your hat? It's sitting crooked." This statement sounds like madness. A man facing death by a beer mug is worried about his killer's style? Bulldozer is momentarily lost. His brain cannot process this information. But instinct takes over. Rage blinds him. He roars and begins to bring the mug down, putting all his mass and malice into the strike. He already sees the glass smashing into Bruce's face, the blood flowing. But he doesn't know that Bruce Lee was waiting for this exact moment. Waiting for the arm to go down, exposing the head. Waiting for the hat to become accessible. In this fraction of a second, separating life from mutilation, Bruce Lee transforms from a tourist into a force of nature, and his target is not the enemy's jaw, but that very dirty piece of felt, which in a moment will become the symbol of the loudest fall in the history of this bar. To understand why this moment became legendary, you have to realize that in 1966, in the Texas backwoods, an Asian man had exactly zero chance of walking out of such a conflict in one piece. The crowd surrounding them was not neutral. It was a pack that had caught the scent of blood, and it was waiting for the kill. Bulldozer was certain that his mug strike was the final argument, the period at the end of a sentence that hadn't even begun. He saw before him not a man, but an obstacle to be demolished. But Bruce Lee saw not a threat, but geometry. In his head, working faster than any computer, a trajectory was already mapped out. The arm goes down. The shoulder opens, the center of gravity shifts forward, and the head, crowned by that very hat, remains unprotected for a split second. Do you think Bruce was going to block the blow? That would be foolish. Stopping 100 kilograms of inertia with an arm means breaking that arm. Bruce decided not to stop the force, but to redirect the attention. When the mug began its deadly descent, Bruce didn't flinch. He took a step forward. This movement was so unexpected that Bulldozer lost focus for a heartbeat. A victim is supposed to run, not attack. But Bruce wasn't attacking in the conventional sense. He was simply changing the distance. His body, relaxed and fluid, slid into the dead zone, the place where the swing no longer has power, but where he himself becomes deadly. Ask yourself honestly, if a glass projectile were flying at you, would you be thinking about style? Bruce was. He decided to turn the fight into a lesson in etiquette. He didn't strike the groin. He didn't poke the eyes. He chose as his target the thing most precious to this biker, his pride, embodied in that filthy hat. At the moment, the giant's arm sliced through the air where Bruce's head had just been. The master's leg soared upward. This wasn't just a kick. It was a vertical split executed with such speed that the eye couldn't track the movement. The toe of his sneaker, light and precise as a surgeon's scalpel, aimed not for the nose or the jaw. It moved tangentially, aiming for the brim. The Santa Barbara effect is working at full throttle here. You expect blood, you expect the crunch of bones, but instead, something surreal happens. Bruce Lee didn't intend to maim his enemy, but to undress him, to strip him of his symbol of power. Bulldozer, having put all his strength into a strike against thin air, began to lose his balance, his body falling forward by inertia. And in that very second, when he was most vulnerable and ridiculous, Bruce's foot reached its goal. This was the moment of truth. If Bruce missed by even a millimeter, the hat would stay put, and the mug might find its mark on the way back. But Bruce Lee did not miss. He was the embodiment of precision. And while the crowd froze, unable to believe their eyes, the very movement that would make everyone forget the fight and remember the magic was already taking shape in the air. In the Rusty Nail bar, that very visual silence descended, where it feels as if even the dust motes in the light have stopped dancing. The sound of Bruce's foot hitting the brim of the hat wasn't loud, but it was so sharp and dry that every patron heard it. Click. It sounded like a lock snapping open. The old cowboy hat, which had sat on Bulldozer's head for decades as if glued there, suddenly came to life. It soared vertically upward, spinning on its axis like a flying saucer launched into space. In the same instant, the hat left its owner. Bruce's knee, continuing its motion, slammed into the biker's elbow joint. It wasn't a heavy blow, but it was delivered to a nerve cluster. The giant's arm went numb, his fingers splayed open involuntarily, and the heavy beer mug slipped from them, sent on its own flight toward the wall. Smash! The glass shattered into 1,000 shards, showering the floor in a rain of sharp splinters. Bulldozer froze. He stood in a ridiculous pose, arm raised, fingers splayed, head bare and defenseless. His face expressed a mixture of shock and childish hurt. He didn't understand what had happened. Where was his hat? Where was his mug? Where was his victory? He looked like a king stripped naked before his subjects. The crowd, which a second ago had been thirsting for blood, was now silent, stunned by the sight. They saw their idol disarmed and humiliated in a fraction of a second, done by a man who hadn't even broken a sweat. But the most interesting thing was happening in the air. The hat, having reached the peak of its trajectory near the ceiling, began to fall. It tumbled downward, and every eye was glued to it. It seemed it would fall into the dirt, into a puddle of spilled beer, and that would be the final point of humiliation. But Bruce Lee wasn't going to let that happen. He tracked the hat like a cat tracks a bird. He hadn't just knocked it off. He was playing with it. At the moment, the felt was level with his shoulder. Bruce made a move that finally broke the brains of everyone present. He didn't catch it with his hands. He used his foot. The hat landed softly on the bridge of his foot, stayed there for a heartbeat, and then, with a light flicking motion, Bruce sent it into his hands. It was a finale worthy of a circus arena, but executed with lethal seriousness. Bruce stood with the hat in his hands, absolutely calm, while Bulldozer was still trying to grasp that he no longer had a weapon. The contrast between them was striking. A massive, sweaty, confused giant and a small, composed man holding the symbol of another's power. Bruce looked at the hat, brushed an invisible speck of dust off it, and took a step toward the biker. The spectators held their breath. What would he do? Strike? Throw the hat away? But Bruce held it out to its owner, and in that gesture there was so much superiority, so much quiet strength, that Bulldozer recoiled as if offered a red-hot coal. He realized he had just been spared, but this mercy was worse than any beating, because it showed him his true place. At the moment Bruce Lee held the dirty, greasy hat back out to its owner, something occurred in the rusty nail that could be called an intellectual orgasm of the collective consciousness. Bulldozer, whose face burned a crimson red resembling an overripe tomato, stood motionless, not daring to reach out. His brain, accustomed to simple fight or flight patterns, had jammed. He expected a punch to the jaw. He expected humiliation. He expected to be thrown out of his own bar. But instead, his crown was being returned to him. Bruce looked him in the eye, and in that gaze, there wasn't a drop of fear, nor a drop of malice. There was only the calm, icy confidence of a teacher returning a confiscated toy to a failing student. "Now it is straight," Bruce said, his voice in the silence of the bar sounding like a sentence. "And your manners should straighten up as well. Respect is not something you demand with a mug in your hand. It is something you deserve when your hands are empty." These words hit the giant harder than any brass knuckles. He realized he hadn't lost a fight. He had lost at life. He was the king of a small, dirty world where might makes right. But Bruce Lee had shown him there is another world, where power is control, not aggression. With trembling hands, still showing traces of beer foam, Bulldozer took his hat. He pressed it to his chest like a shield, trying to hide behind it from the eyes of the crowd. And in that moment, a miracle happened. Someone in the back of the room began to clap. One clap, a second, a third, and a second later the entire bar. All these rugged Texas men who a minute ago wanted to tear the stranger apart exploded in applause. They weren't applauding a victory in a fight. They were applauding style. They were applauding how gracefully and bloodlessly a conflict that could have ended in a stabbing had been resolved. Bulldozer slowly sank into his chair. His legs wouldn't hold him. He felt hollowed out, gutted, but at the same time, strangely relieved. He was no longer obligated to maintain the image of an invincible monster. He was just a man who had been taught a lesson. He looked at Bruce, who had already turned away and was calmly finishing his water, and made a gesture to the bartender. "Pour him one," he said hoarsely. "On me, and one for me too. A double." It was a surrender, but it was a surrender with honor. Bruce nodded without turning around, accepting this gesture of peace. He knew he had won more than just a skirmish. He had won the respect of an enemy, and that is worth more than any medal. But in his head the thought was already spinning that this lesson had been too easy, and that the real fight, the fight against the prejudices of an entire country, was still ahead. And when he set the empty glass on the counter, the sound of glass on wood rang out like the period at the end of a sentence that changed the history of this little Texas bar forever. When Bruce Lee stepped out of the rusty nail, the Texas sunset painted the sky in colors of blood and gold, creating the perfect backdrop for the finale of this drama. He straightened the collar of his jacket, put on his dark glasses, and inhaled the hot, dusty air of the prairies. Behind him, in the smoke-filled room, remained a legend that would be retold here for decades. But for Bruce himself, it wasn't a feat. It was routine. He got into his car, started the engine, and looked in the rearview mirror. There, in the doorway of the bar, stood Bulldozer. The giant was clutching his hat in his hands, and his posture no longer held that threatening confidence. He looked like a man who had just seen God and realized that God wears sneakers, and speaks with an accent. That look was a better reward than any championship belt. Bruce smiled at his reflection and hit the gas, leaving behind a cloud of dust and shattered stereotypes. But this story leaves us with a question that rings louder than any gong strike. We live in a world where aggression is often considered the norm, where it is customary to answer rudeness with rudeness and a blow with a blow. Bruce Lee showed us an alternative. He showed that you can win without utterly humiliating, that you can break the enemy's weapon but save his face. That style and control are weapons that hit harder than brass knuckles. Ask yourself honestly, what would you have done? In an era of internet trolls and road rage, could you answer a spit with a smile and a lesson in politeness? Or would you let anger take over, turning the conflict into a dirty fight with no winners? Whose side are you on in this eternal debate? The side of brute force, which demands blood for an insult, or the side of elegant style, which turns the enemy into a laughingstock but gives him a chance to redeem himself? Who was Bruce Lee that evening? A hero who punished a racist and defended his honor, or an artist for whom life is a stage and people are merely props for his tricks? Write one word in the comments: power or style. I will be waiting for your answers, because it is in them that the understanding lies of who we truly are. Barbarians with clubs, or masters capable of stopping a war with a single movement of a leg. And did you notice that Bruce didn't even finish his water? Write whether you think this is a sign of disdain or the highest form of concentration.